Our presenter today, Marina Kirsch, spent over 4 years researching and writing the story of her family from the Axis side of World War II in Latvia, occupied Poland, and Germany. Her book, Flight of Remembrance, was an award-winning finalist in the narrative nonfiction category of the 2012 USA Best Book Awards. In the past 6 years, she has spoken at venues in 10 states, including libraries, museums, retirement communities, and lifelong learning institutes and churches. Her presentations help ensure that lessons and memories from the war are preserved for posterity and provide an opportunity for audiences to gain a new perspective on World War II. Marina lives in Kensington, New Hampshire. She's a graphic designer as well as a book designer and editor, and a New Hampshire Humanities to Go speaker. For over 6 years, she has also been a member and officer of Toastmasters International, a worldwide organization that helps members gain public speaking and leadership skills. And now, please join me in welcoming Marina Kirsch.
Thank you, Pastor. Is there value in stories from both sides of a world conflict, or only in those from the side of the victors, especially if they vanquished a brutal regime that caused the death of 50 to 70 million people worldwide? I had no idea how many people that is. I did some math. If you buried 5 people a day, it would take you over 27,000 years to bury 50 million. And pastors present, if you buried 5 a day and you needed to bury 70 million, it would take you more than 38,000 years. World War II was a cataclysm without precedent. Happy Veterans Day to everyone. Today you are going to hear a wartime story that differs from most you've heard in the past. My family's story, as recorded in my book, Flight of Remembrance, is from the Axis side of the war, and it includes 2 German veterans, my father and my grandfather. The 2 main protagonists, my parents, Rolf, a Latvian aeronautical engineering student, and Lilo Wasul, the young woman that he met in 1940 Berlin. In 2004, long before I started writing my book, someone said, "But it's a story about Nazis." That comment came despite the fact that no one on either side of my family joined the Nazi Party or supported Hitler. A lot of Americans do not know that. Many people in Germany did not support the regime. It did lead me to ponder, though, that comment, whether the timing would ever be right for a story about German people during World War II. I came to recognize, however, that there is great value in a story that gives a face, a name, and humanity to the enemy, rather than denying or burying the past. I would like to say thank you, first of all, to Grace Lutheran Church for hosting me here, especially Pastor Meyer and Diana Hoff. And I would also like to thank all of you for being here. I am so delighted that you're here. In addition, though, Paul Hathaway, our cameraman from Access Nashua, thank you so much, Paul, for your determination to make this a successful event. What can you possibly gain from a story about people who were in Germany during World War II? The enemy. I can think of 3 things. First, you will hear how love and dreams supported by faith in God help people to stave off despair and to survive any adversity. Our dreams today are the hope for tomorrow, something we should always remember. 2, you will hear about what it was like to live through war waged on home soil on the losing side, something that only happened here in the US during the Civil War. And the third thing is you will help to preserve memories, not only of World War II, but of the Holocaust. I talk about that too. And for those of you who perhaps had ancestors who were in Germany or parts of Europe during the war, you might even retrieve some lost parts of your own family story by hearing this story. Now I'd like to find out what stories we have in this room. I know that there are some already. First of all, how many veterans do we have? Let's raise hands. Okay, we have quite a number of veterans. And I always ask this even though you all look far too young. Are there any World War II veterans present? No hands are up. How about spouses of World War II veterans? No spouses. How many of you had relatives who served during the war on either side, on the side of the Axis or on the side of the Allies? Raise your hand, please. All right, now we have a lot of hands up. My final question is, were any of you or your parents or grandparents in a part of the world where the war was fought? So that would be Germany, Ukraine, Russia, Japan, North Africa, Philippines, probably a few other places as well. Anybody other than my brother and I? Yes, where were your ancestors?
In Germany.
In Germany, okay. And there was another hand up?
Norway.
In Norway. There's a hand up at the very back.
North Africa.
North Africa. Okay, we have quite a representation here. Were there any hands up on this side? Yes.
Poland.
Excuse me?
Poland.
Poland. Oh my goodness. Poland, one of the most devastated countries during the entire war. I would like the veterans again, once again, to raise their hands, please. All of you veterans. Some of you, I know, I've spoken with you. You served in the Vietnam War and other wars. I don't know what you folks have gone through, and I don't know, none of us probably know, what you go through continually because of your service. But we want to honor you, and we want to thank you. Now I will launch into my family story in a nutshell, as shown on the cover of the book. Actually, before I go to that, I'd like to ask how many of you know about New Hampshire Humanities? Anybody familiar with New Hampshire Humanities? Yes, someone over here. Still a pretty well-kept secret, I guess. I am a New Hampshire Humanities presenter, and even though this event is not a humanities event, I always give the organization a pitch. New Hampshire Humanities is one of, in my opinion, the most successful organizations of its kind that helps nonprofit organizations to hold successful events. We are very fortunate to have them in the Granite State, and I feel privileged to be a New Hampshire Humanities presenter. Please support their efforts to provide quality events around our state. Now, my family story in a nutshell. The man with the helmet. My father, Rolf, after fleeing Latvia before the first Soviet takeover, ending up in Germany and being drafted into the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force. The swastika on his helmet, I decided I needed to keep it. It is the only element on the cover of the book that identifies this as a story from the Axis side of the war and not an Allied story. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, wedding day, November 1944. My older brother Ingo, age 2, born in post-war Bavaria. He's already been introduced, but I will mention him a bit more later. Above the title, flying in, a little icon, That is an illustration I did of my father flying a pre-World War II Latvian glider. That little icon represents two things. First of all, my father Rolf's overarching goal in life to further the field of aeronautical engineering. It was his dream. But secondly, it represents my own quest for a higher and a wider perspective on World War II. And thanks to audiences like you, my perspective continues to grow with every event that I give. Behind the people, by the way, is rubble. It is the ruined family home in Berlin, bombed by the Allies in 1944. And here, the finalist award symbol from the 2012 USA Best Book Awards in the narrative nonfiction category. Has anyone present read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? Who's heard of it? Okay, a number of you have heard of it. If you sign my mailing list that's going around, I will send you my suggested reading list with World War II material. Frankl was an Austrian Jew who survived the concentration camp system during World War II. After the war, he developed the third Viennese school of psychotherapy known as logotherapy, which is all about finding meaning in life. Such an important thing. Viktor Frankl found meaning even at Auschwitz. My parents and grandparents, even though they never knew Frankl, never met him, never read his books, were able to find meaning in their lives through their Christian faith. And they were also able to visualize a life beyond the cataclysm. Let's time travel now to 1924 Latvia. My father Rolf, the 5-year-old boy with his mother Maria, his little sister Ruth, and his father Ernst. Ernst had a dream too. From boyhood, sitting on a hillside of his family's farm and looking out at a sliver of the Baltic Sea on the horizon, his dream was always the same. He wanted to be captain of a ship bound for America, but that would not be possible during World War II. My father Rolf is at the left. Already by age 14, he's been building model gliders for years from plans in German and American magazines. Like a lot of young people at that time, he wanted to be part of the exciting new field of aeronautical engineering. By age 18, here he is with a Latvian National Award-winning glider. And by this time, he's building his first full-size motorized plane and his first full-sized manned glider. Here he is flying that glider. He was with a group of young men called the Izargs, the closest thing that Latvia had to a National Guard in between the world wars. That group was completely disbanded after the first Soviet takeover, which occurred in 1940. You'll see something interesting in this photograph. My grandmother Maria was wearing the same dress in 1935 that I have on. She hand-tailored and embroidered it in the early 1930s and altered it to fit me when I was a teenager. Amazingly, it still fits. I do want to show the back of the sleeves, which I feel is the most amazing feature of the dress. The embroidery pattern is an authentic Latvian pattern. It was identified by a costume museum in Riga. And the jewelry I'm wearing, it's called a kuazem brooch. It is from the southwestern part of Latvia on the Baltic Sea where the family lived. And these were worn by women as a sign of the family's wealth. If you had 4 or 5 of them, you would wear them all, of course, to make a better impression. An amazing collection of my grandmother's beautiful needlework survived the war. But in addition, photographs, documents, letters, and memorabilia survived the war. However, the thing that I treasure most is a family history that was written by my parents, Rolf and Lilo, in the early 1990s and passed on to their children and grandchildren. It was then that I realized what a treasure my family's story is, and I was determined that I needed to find a way to share it. Love through preservation is a treasure for future generations. Everybody consider what perhaps should be preserved and shared from your own or your family's past. Which country, and if you know the answer, shout it out, which country was most feared across Europe during World War II, especially by people of German descent?
Russia.
Russia, yes. And actually, it was the Soviet Union, but nobody called it that. In German, it was Russland. Russia. In October 1939, my father, Rolf, was studying aeronautical engineering at the University of Riga when an ominous phone call came from his father, Ernst, urging him to return home immediately. That phone call marked the end of life as Rolf knew it. A Soviet takeover was imminent. And for families like the Dutzman family of German heritage, and they were scattered all over Europe, they faced a much higher risk of execution or deportation under a Soviet takeover than a lot of other people did. Especially at risk, my grandfather Ernst. He had served as a Tsarist Russian officer during World War I. He was a Latvian army major between the two world wars, and in addition, an outspoken anti-communist. He would not have lasted under Soviet domination. The Dutzman family in 1939 had not put a verdict on the Nazi regime yet, but the Stalin regime had long been recognized as a regime with little or no respect for human life. They could have given in to all this, but instead, their love for each other and their dreams for the future led them to make the decision to escape Latvia while they could. Rolf, with his mother Maria and sister Ruth, shortly before they, Ernst, and 50,000 other Latvians of Baltic German descent fled Latvia in December 1939. It was their big chance to get out while the going was good. And their sense of foreboding was chillingly accurate. After the Soviet takeover, officers who had failed to flee, Latvian officers, were shot on the spot, and tens of thousands of other Latvian citizens were either deported or executed. Latvia, like many other countries, especially in Eastern Europe, the other two Baltic states as well, suffered wave upon wave of tragedy. The Soviet takeover of 1940, then in 1942, a Nazi German occupation. During that time, 75,000 Latvian Jews were murdered. This photograph was taken from German military archives. And as we know, in 1945, another brutal Soviet takeover, each time mass exterminations and deportations. A map of Northern Europe, circa December 1939. The map has been changing exponentially already by this time. In the light tan, Germany proper, including East Prussia off to the right. In the darker tan, countries that Germany had already taken over, annexed, including the former Austria, and half of the former Poland. In the red, the other half of Poland, part of it is off the map, taken over by the Soviet Union. Two other countries involved in the story, Switzerland and Slovakia at the bottom in orange. And up north, the three Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They are like a string of jewels at the edge of the Soviet Union on the Baltic Sea, countries very much desired by the Soviets. When the family lived north of a city called Liepaja in a military enclave called Kara Osta on the Baltic Sea. And that's where my grandfather Ernst was head of a department in a munitions laboratory. When the family fled, they fled from the capital city of Riga via this dotted line trajectory down to an island called Usedom, which was part of Germany proper. When their ship left the port, they and 2,000 other Latvians on board became people without a home, people without a national identity, and people who could be drafted upon arrival. That was one of the worst fears. They were sailing into the darkness of an uncertain fate under the Nazi regime. And I'm over here in the dark for a reason. The entire world was descending into darkness and despair and devastation, as well as destruction. The next worst fear came to pass. Did you see that? They were sent to occupied Poland, first to the city of Posen. It was the most dangerous place in all of Europe at the time, occupied Poland. Rolf is on the train. He is apprehensive. What will happen next? Will the regime draft him immediately, or will they allow him to finish his aeronautical engineering education? At the left of this photo, his mother, Maria, my grandmother, the one who made this dress, wondering what the family's fate will be. Their immediate fate. In Posen, they were housed in crude, unheated barracks. The food was equally dismal, and they slept on straw on the floor. But that, too, did not last long. From Posen, they were sent even further eastward to Litzmannstadt or Lodz. Look how close they are getting now to Soviet-occupied territory. The regime next, though, sent them to Berlin, which for the family was a relief. And by 1942, the regime had already realized Ernst's technical skills. They drafted him as a major into the Wehrmacht, the German army, and sent him back north to that island of Usedom, where he served under Werner von Braun at a place called Peenemünde. How many of you have heard of Werner von Braun, the rocket expert? Okay, quite a few of you. Peenemünde, you've heard of Peenemünde? It was there that my grandfather Ernst trained under Werner von Braun for V-2 rocket inspection. That installation, though, top secret at one point, was bombed in August 1943, and then the regime chose a safer place in the heart of Germany near a town called Nordhausen, where there was an immense underground installation for the mass production of the V1 and the V2. It was there that my grandfather Ernst was sent for the last 14 months of the war to work as chief inspector of the V2. That last little thing that just floated in there, that is the city of Gdansk, or Danzig in German, in German-occupied Poland. A bit more about that later, but I wanted to let you know where it was. Let's go now to the other side of the story. My mother, Lilo, is a little 2-year-old girl in the center between her parents, Gertrude and Walter Wassil. Lilo was born and raised in Berlin. She had a different perspective on Hitler and the Nazi regime than Rolf did, having seen what was going on from a younger age. No one in her family joined the Nazi Party or supported Hitler either. Lilo is 10 years old in this photo. A little bit after that, she refused to join the League of German Girls, similar to the Hitler Youth for boys. She said to her mother, "They are sinister, fanatical, and atheistic, and I want nothing to do with that group." Fortunately for Lilo, she was not forced to join, but a year after she graduated, all young people were forced to join the Nazi youth groups. Here she is age 19. Lilo had a dream. Do you see a theme developing? Her dream was for a harmonious marriage and home life, something that didn't exist during her growing up years because her parents had a very rocky marriage that ended in divorce when Lilo was 13. At this point, she is about to meet my father, Rolf, and her personal dream would then commence. The city of Danzig or Gdansk. When the family, Rolf's family, arrived in Berlin, he received word that he would be allowed to finish his aeronautical engineering education, a great relief for him. He was allowed to go to the city of Gdansk to study at the technical university there. And this city had been for a long time a free city of Europe, but it was free no longer. This photo is from Getty Images taken in 1939, and as you can see, freedom is a thing of the past. Rolf's dream came crashing down. In December of 1941, the same day that he received his diploma in aeronautical engineering, he also received his draft notice into the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He had hoped the war would be long over before he graduated, but it would go on for years yet. And there were two words that were often in the news at that time that struck fear into the heart of all German military personnel. Would anyone like to shout it out? Had to do with Russia. Eastern Front. Now in German it's one word, Ostfront. It could be that Rolf is reading one of the horrifying stories that were filtering back from the snow-bound vastness of the Russian countryside at that time. It was where no one wanted to be sent. Rolf was fortunate, though, because of his technical expertise. He was shielded from the front. He actually taught airplane design for a time. Then he was assigned to navigator training, and he also trained on full-size gliders and received certifications in that. He wasn't sent to the front until the very end of the war. And also his pursuits helped to support the dream that he still harbored about a future at some point if the war would ever end. 1.4 million tons of bombs fell on Germany during World War II. 363 air raids over Berlin alone. Now there were two cities that suffered even worse bombing than Berlin because of the intensity of the bombing and the resulting firestorms. Would anyone like to venture a guess which two cities they were? Hamburg. Dresden. Very good. You folks are on the ball. This is a photograph of Rolf's family's home in Berlin, bombed in March of 1944. Exterior and interior. We have these photos only because Rolf took bombing leave to go and inspect the damage. Lilo's home was also destroyed, one floor at a time, until finally the top two floors blown away, walls and ceiling damaged, windows shattered, pipes burst, and water flowing into the apartment. They could no longer live there. But the regime had a rule, and the rule was no working person leaves Berlin. But love and dreams, they persisted, and eventually they obtained permission to move out of the beleaguered city, and that probably saved their lives. All of Lilo's family members, though, except for her mother Gertrude, remained trapped in the eastern part of Germany, which came under Soviet domination. She never saw any of them again, including her father. One other thing. Many long, cold nights, sitting in bomb shelters under the city of Berlin. One of Lilo's most comforting thoughts was Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. That gave her great comfort during dark times. This is the only known photograph of my grandfather Ernst at the underground installation of Mittelwerk, where the V1 and the V2 were mass produced. He is the one who is seated, and he is signing off on some papers. I had to do a lot of research about my grandfather's role during the war because he never talked about it. I researched books, post-war transcripts, online sources, anything I could find. But I had a feeling of dread when I found out that there was a notorious slave labor camp outside the gates of this installation. It was called the Mittelbau-Dora camp. And thousands of inmates were sent there to labor and die. I dreaded what else I might find out. Through books and post-war transcripts written by inmates, I found out, and by other folks as well, I found out that my grandfather had 200 Army and civilian engineers working under him. And there were 3 inmates. And thanks to one of those inmates, a Czech by the name of Yuri Benish, who wrote not only post-war transcripts, but also wrote a book. He talks about the fact that my grandfather befriended him and also saved his life on more than one occasion when the SS wanted to interrogate him for sabotage. He admitted he was committing sabotage. He would have been executed, but my grandfather saved his life, saved him from being interrogated. I was relieved to find that out. This photograph and other documents from my grandfather's time in this place were later donated to the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp memorial that now stands at the site of the former camp. As his grandchild, I have 2 regrets. One is that my grandfather probably never knew that Yuri Benish had survived the war. And second, that my grandfather will forever be listed as a perpetrator just for having worked at this place. One of the underground tunnels, as it looks today, a vast underground network of tunnels. I visited there a few years ago. Today, this is a place of commemoration of the inmates who toiled and died there. Even as the Allies were poised to strike into Germany proper from the east and the west in November of 1944, a love story was playing out that would span more than 70 years and across 2 continents. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, got married on this day, November 24th, 1944. But the most difficult times for military personnel and civilians alike were still ahead. Within 6 months after these 2 photographs were taken, and others, we have quite a collection, Rolf and Ernst would be taken prisoner of war, and Lilo and her mother Gertrude would be forced to escape the encroaching Soviet troops more than once. The hardest thing of all, though, was that for almost a year, neither Rolf nor Lilo knew if the other was still alive. Toward the very end of the war, Rolf was in Slovakia for a short time, in between assignments here, but shortly after this photo was taken, he and tens of thousands of other German military personnel were sent to the front, to the Rhine River. It was the most dreadful thing that Rolf could ever imagine. But once they arrived there, with no personal weapons left to be given out, and the war as good as over, they were given the order to disperse. They knew what that meant. It meant desert, escape the front, go homeward if you can. Rolf walked 160 miles homeward in late winter, hoping that there was still a home and a family left to return to. And this, dear friends, is the main difference between waging war somewhere on foreign soil and waging war on home soil, because not only military personnel, but homes and families are also at great risk. Between this photograph and the next one, I am leaving out the most cathartic part of this story, which I hope you might want to read about in the book. It's a story about how love and dreams aided by Lilo's mother Gertrude, my grandmother, a major mover and shaker in this story, by the way, how love and dreams aided by Grandma forged a very dramatic reunion. One of my favorite photographs, jumping now to post-war Germany, of my parents Rolf and Lilo. They are smiling down at their post-war dream. My brother Ingo. My brother Ingo right here, seated in the front. At age 2, and then at age 3. Now notice he has grown a tail. That tail was because of the sense of humor of my grandmother Maria, who made this dress. She decided to take a foxtail off her coat and put it on the back of his overalls. And they loved watching the fox child play in the vegetable garden. This is a good point for me to interject what it was like to be a child of people who were in Germany during World War II. My brother Ingo and I have had questions all our lives about complicity and awareness. How much did they, everyone, but our parents included, know about death camps, the Holocaust, the horrors? Originally, my feeling was I knew everyone had to have known everything. It was such a vast phenomenon. So many people died. There were so many perpetrators. There were Hitler speeches. How could they not have known? However, after many years of research and reading and discussion, including with our parents, I realized the truth is not so simple. I was forced to revise my opinion. Who did know? The people in Germany who knew. People in the higher echelons of the military, the government, many institutions and some industries. People working in those also knew. However, the Nazi regime never publicized the killings and the genocide, and neither did Allied reports during the war. Those came after the war. What did people know? Everybody knew concentration camps existed. They didn't necessarily know about the death camps. Of course, concentration camps were bad enough. But here's the other thing that so many people didn't know. They did not know who was arrested and sent to those camps, necessarily. And many of them did not know what happened in those camps. They didn't know of the terrible treatment and the executions and the starvations and working people to death. My parents, Rolf and Lilo, were horrified to find out about the industrial-scale genocide after the war. Now, it is entirely possible that my grandfather Ernst knew because he worked in 2 installations where there were camps. But here's the caveat. Perhaps he even did not know about the genocide because in the camps where he worked were captured partisans and resistance fighters from the countries with which Germany was at war. And by and large, not Jews or members of other persecuted groups, until some of them were sent there toward the very end of the war from Hungary. There is a book on my suggested reading list. If you sign the list going around, it's entitled What We Knew. The authors, Johnson and Rubin, come to the conclusion that about 1/3 of German people knew everything, all the gruesome facts. About 1/3 heard rumors or knew something but did not have proof, and the other third may have been completely clueless. I welcome questions and discussion at the end about this. Yes, the family had survived, but Germany was a humanitarian disaster site, inundated by 14 million hungry, homeless, and destitute refugees. By comparison, Germany today is having no problems at all. And not only they were hungry and homeless, almost everyone was. But perhaps worst of all, the Soviet threat was still hanging over them. Another Soviet occupation, even in the western part of Germany, could take place at any time. Do we have immigrants in the room other than Ingo and me? Please raise your hand. Yes, we have one at the back. We have one here. We have one there. We have about 5. Okay. My family was enabled to immigrate to America in late 1951, thanks to the generosity of people in a tiny farming community in northern Indiana. On a mid-December day, a foggy, cold mid-December day in 1951, my father Rolf, my mother Lilo, 8 months pregnant, and my brother Ingo took their leave of Germany. They traveled across a rubble-strewn countryside and arrived in Switzerland only to find that their flight to America would be postponed because of the fog that covered all of Northern Europe. But the next morning, on the brink of my family's odyssey to the New World, I decided to emerge into the post-war Old World. I completely disrupted their immigration plans by my premature arrival. And I didn't even say sorry for the inconvenience. We did eventually, though, arrive in Wakarusa, Indiana, where our generous sponsors lived. I was so impressed with their sacrifice on our behalf that I dedicated my book to the people of Wakarusa in addition to my parents. I've also traveled there several times to give book events, and we have reconnected with people who remember us from the early 1950s. Love and dreams. It goes on. My brothers and I here are in the backyard of the first house that we rented after we arrived in America. Remember my grandfather Ernst's dream to be captain of a ship bound for America? Well, in 1952, he and my grandmother Maria boarded a ship bound for America. No, he was not the captain, but the way that I see it, for the first time in his adult life, his technical skills were no longer bound to the military of any world regime, and he became the captain of his own destiny. They joined us in Wakarusa. 1958, we were proud to become naturalized U.S. citizens, all except for my younger brother at the lower left. And shortly after this photograph was taken, in a remarkable twist on a lifelong dream, my father Rolf and my grandfather Ernst were both hired by Chrysler Missile and Space Division near Detroit, where my father Rolf headed a team of engineers that designed and built components of the Saturn IB rocket, which were later used successfully in all of the Apollo moon missions. My father's dreams were not only not derailed by war and hardship and disaster, but instead, his career expanded to a key role in the emerging U.S. space program. And my mother Lilo, a harmonious marriage and family life. She got her dream too. At the back right, my grandmother Gertrude, the mover and shaker in the late wartime and post-war story. After retirement, my father had to forge a new dream, and it was to share his aerospace engineering and enthusiasm with thousands of children and adults all over the Granite State. Here, with a group of young astronauts in 1983, and here in 2011, with summer campers who have built their model rockets and are about to launch. My parents' love story is as much about finding meaning, cherishing a dream, and living a life based on faith in God as it is about survival. I encourage each of you to discover that gem of meaning that you can use to uplift and encourage others. Finally, in closing, this photograph from a 2013 model rocket launch is a reminder that what we share lives on in the lives and memories of those we inspire. And may we create today a tomorrow where all people are free to live their dreams and fulfill their life's purpose. Thank you.